So what's new on your end?
Well, gee, I've been researching the developments with this UFO news that has been going on, and I've been, doing the same sort of work that we discussed recently, and I've been doing some thinking about Parmenides and Heraclitus, and I've had the thought lately that. The problem with Western philosophy is that everybody sides either implicitly with one of the two of those figures, at least symbolically speaking. And the reality is that they're both right, except from a different point of view. And, in philosophy of science, they talk about the possibility that you have these two alternatives. You have presentism or you have eternalism. And from one point of view, only the present moment is real. But from the point of view of general relativity or quantum cosmology, the past, the present, the future, they all exist simultaneously. And it might be that it's just our perception that's traversing the frames in between time.
Well, that's interesting. What leads you, what causes you to consider these two in particular recently?
Well, a couple months ago, I was digging back into the pre-Socratics again, and I just really found it extraordinary the wealth of perspectives that we came to relatively early in the Western tradition. This tremendous outpouring where we cover all of the ground, everything that you could possibly think about the large-scale nature of reality, even about practical things like the size of the Earth or evolution, or you have people dealing with what a lot of what you would think would be surprisingly modern notions, and so I was enamored of that for some time, and I would say that I've just had a curiosity about time, and what is time, and why does time pass, and when you put together, looking at those figures again and sort of vexing over the nature of time, then you have a recipe for going down this particular rabbit hole.
Well, in listening to what you say, I'm reminded of the Kantian tables, the antinomies, and it occurs to me that even though for Kant, for any given for any given argument, excuse me, this nicotine gum is fucking me up. For a given argument, he presents, say, 2 points of view. I think it's possible that at bottom, number one, there may be more than 2 points of view. In fact, I believe there are, and yet they still may all be antinomical, which is to say they can be resolved. Now, if you mention something like quantum theory, that holds at least the promise of Christ Almighty. Holds the promise at least of any of these questions, or the question of time in particular, being settled empirically. That is to say, if the past is retained somehow, and if the future exists in some form, and therefore past, present, future are actual objective categories and say even further that from the point of view outside of time or eternity taken as a whole, they all exist simultaneously, so on and so forth. Whatever it is that you wish to actually say. In principle, it may be possible to settle the question empirically, but setting that aside, I think it's possible not only for those two representative thinkers that you mentioned to both be true, or the positions that they're said to advance to both be true, but for there to be others as well that may also be true in a sense, in that antinomical sense.
Yeah, and it might be that that's what Hegel was getting at when he talks about every different philosophy as being a phase in the life of truth, and only the whole is true, only the whole unfolded development. So if you could step outside of that and look at it from outside of time, I think that it would essentially be what you're saying. It's not just two things that wind up being complementary or non-dual, but that it's a whole complex matrix of things which seem to exclude each other logically, but which, looked at under the aegis of this more inclusive domain, they're not actually contradictory.
I'd been thinking about time myself recently a little bit, and it seemed to me that the best that could be said is that there's a present, but the present is something that, well, it's hard to say. You can almost think of it like a struck bell, and that is, you hear echoes of the bell, they sort of emanate and they dissipate. So there's a present only to the extent that it's already dissipating into what we call the future, but of course the future never arrives. The past doesn't exist. The future never arrives except, and it also doesn't exist except maybe as a way of decompleting the present. So the present is constantly emptying itself out. And so what we call the future is a direction that we assign to this emptying. But it's an odd thing to consider because in this model, or seen from this point of view at any rate, you don't have three terms. You don't have past, present, future. You have sort of the present within which there's a sort of whole. And the whole is something that we name. We give the name the future. And that's just another way, it could be put in much better terms and sharpened conceptually, like any of these points of view. But to say that all being is one, and that time, in a sense, doesn't exist, or time's an illusion, or all the different modalities on the one side, and the other side to say, well, everything is change, everything is constantly changing, and there are still many other conceivable ways to look at it.
Yeah, in a way, I think there's a really related concern to that, which is skepticism. And I guess maybe you could say questions of foundational epistemology. And I think they're directly related. And I think they have to do with what we make of the relationship between the past and the present and the future. I guess we could call that our temporal ontology. And it seems to me that there's no satisfactory solution to skepticism on the table right now, beyond the fact that this is happening, this is right now. Because the skeptic can always say, well, in principle, you might have been created 1 second ago, and all of your memories might have been created 1 second ago, and let's say there's some kind of cosmic computer, like a matryoshka brain, that's running your consciousness, and it can kill the program before you can traverse enough of your representation of the world to see to it that your map isn't actually coherent. But you have that satisfactory feeling of coherence and of temporal continuity now. And really, if we assume the possibility that reality could be simulated in a really comprehensive way, like I was just talking about, then it's possible that your whole cognitive experience might span, 2 or 3 seconds. And thus, if that form of skepticism is valid, then the only thing you have is this sort of Cartesian starting point. Except that the Cartesian starting point already presupposes different things. The cognitive agent, the active cognition, maybe you could call it the property of being. I think, therefore I am. But really, it's like there is experience. But even calling it experience or being is attributing a kind of definition to it that has a certain range of, shall we say, denotations and connotations. And really, the only thing you can say is this sort of not even tautological statement, which is there is, right? And it seems to me that that accords very much with what you're saying about the present.
Well, that makes me think, I can't at this point really discuss it in a very sophisticated way, but there are at least two types of skepticism. There's a skepticism that would submit things to methodical doubt. And this sort of iterative skepticism is something that you might identify in Descartes before he comes up with his positive program, which is that you could submit this to doubt, this to doubt, this to doubt, this to doubt. There is another kind of skepticism, though, which I think is more what you find when you look at the skepticisms of antiquity, and that is the sort of classical skepticism that says that one can know nothing. And that's not necessarily the result of any kind of methodical or systematic doubt. It's sort of a meta position. And it strikes me as being similar to what you find with American pragmatism. I've never regarded pragmatism as philosophy myself, even though it seeks to inhabit the same territory. The reason why is because when you have recourse to other criteria, you basically leave the philosophical enterprise behind. If you have a question, is the man guilty or is he not guilty, posed in those strict terms, to say, for example, well, he is tall, may well be true, but it's a way of evading the question. And if you look at a number of the more prominent American pragmatist thinkers, in a lot of ways, what they're trying to do is simply to evade the questions. They may do that by saying that the questions aren't valid or they're unanswerable and so on, but they're having a recourse to other criteria. For example, the criterion of utility. Is it useful to ask this question? You have certain thinkers who will say a whole range of standard established philosophical questions are not useful. It's similar also to analytic philosophy, at least in its origins, where you have the obsession with what philosophical questions are meaningful. The idea is that you can disqualify some number of philosophical statements, and then by extension, philosophical arguments, and then, of course, ultimately, philosophers as figures by saying, well, what they're looking for, the questions they're asking simply aren't meaningful. For good or bad, if you are practicing philosophy, you are going down a very strict path with questions being posed that simply can't be sidestepped for other reasons. Now, that, of course, is, again, not exactly what classical skepticism was doing, because classical skepticism, to my mind, as far as I know, unlike pragmatism, ejects from the enterprise early. But to circle back around to Parmenides and Heraclitus, I think you see a lot more affinity between the classic skeptical approach and these so-called pre-Socratic thinkers. Because even though they are clearly facing the same way, in the same direction that philosophy will later, they are not down the path. They're not doing the same thing, not really that more modern philosophers do. That's a set of observations that doesn't engage directly with what you said, but for what it's worth.
So your voice was breaking up a little bit in the last 30 seconds. I was thinking that since this is recording both audio channels, I would let you continue without interrupting you. But maybe just for my sake, so that I understand what's going on, you could just repeat the last maybe minute and a half to 2 minutes of what you said.
Well, I can try. I was relating, at least from my point of view, the classical skeptics who start from a position from the outset that one can know nothing, and relating them on the one hand to Heraclitus, Parmenides, the so-called pre-Socratic thinkers who are not doing philosophy at all in the same way that the moderns do. But on the other hand, on the other side, if there is a spectrum comparing them to pragmatism, 20th century pragmatism, and even to analytic philosophy more generally. Because in a way, all of them, all of the ones I just mentioned, are sort of on the fringes of philosophy, it seems to me, for good or bad. I'm not saying that disqualifies them. There was an example that I mentioned, somebody could be on trial for murder, and the question could be in very strict terms, is he guilty or not guilty? Now, you might observe that he's tall. The observation that he's tall may well be entirely true, but it does not exist. It has no function within the question posed, is he guilty or not guilty? If you look at 20th century pragmatism, I've never really regarded it as philosophy because it tries to evade the questions of philosophy as posed. And there are all sorts of forms that the evasions take. The same even goes from a certain perspective for analytic philosophy in the beginning, trying to determine what questions, philosophical questions, are meaningful, quote unquote, and what ones are not meaningful, with an eye toward disqualifying whole sets of questions and therefore whole sets of philosophical arguments and positions, and ultimately philosophical figures. But it's a similar impulse. But they're sort of on, the philosophers of antiquity are sort of on one side of it, and the moderns are on another side, and in between you have philosophy as it takes place as we understand it. where the questions and the problems faced have to be pursued rigorously to the end, even if the end is pure impasse. Or if, in some cases, if the end is, a set of horrible conclusions. So I agree in the one sense that people like Parmenides and Heraclitus, they're not doing philosophy in the modern sense. And it's very hard to recognize in what they're doing, what we, the types of things we see in Kant or Hegel or any of the other moderns. Of course, they're pointed in the right direction. They're pointed in the direction of what we recognize as philosophy. And yet, it's almost, it's a very foreign thing if you go back and you look at some of these fragments. On the one hand, the questions that they're dealing with, once you make sense of them, seem very familiar. They seem completely fundamental. And you can say that the questions have never been answered, nor have they been surpassed. But in the fragments that survive themselves, I mean, it's practically an alien language, an alien world.
Yeah, it is. It is a different world, and there's a kind of sanitized picture of ancient Greece that I think a lot of people have, if they haven't spent some time sort of reading about the period and kind of inhabiting it historically in their imagination. But it's kind of a strange feeling looking at that period, because there is something very much like the modern West, and there is another undercurrent which is really different than it. And in all of the pre-Socratics, it's funny because people who are leaning in the direction of scientism, they'll try to appropriate the pre-Socratics as being figures akin to themselves, in as much as they were asking questions about the natural world. All of them have this, they have a text called like On Nature, and they're inquiring into the hypokaimenon, the underlying thing that is, and they're going about it with pretty naturalistic questions. Don't invoke anything that can't be adjudicated by reason. But the funny thing is, even though scientism, or maybe not that, it doesn't have to be that extreme, people who are enamored of materialist physicalism can say these are our guys. It's also the case that they are thoroughly mystical, first and foremost, and there's no separation as of yet between rationalism, empiricism, and mysticism.
Yeah, to my mind, this tendency that you mentioned to go back and find these and identify these thinkers, these philosophers as being natural scientists and so on, certainly says more about the present, and it says more about the way that philosophy is regarded by those who are doing it, today's scientists and maybe historians and so on. You have to ask, what is this kind of neurotic relationship to philosophy that a lot of these prominent intellectual figures have today and have had for a long time? Because on the one hand, it's not as if they study these philosophers in any way. I mean, they don't. So they really know nothing about them. On the other hand, they have a rivalry and a distaste it's sort of like the neurotic relationship to the other. And I'm talking about, modern scientists, contemporary scientists, and intellectuals, and so on. When they talk about philosophy, they all have the same point of view. Philosophy is a bunch of bullshit, and so on, so on. But they've never engaged with it. So what are they really talking about? Why are they projecting onto philosophy what it is that they do in the way that they do? And it's an interesting question because, of course, one day, who knows, it could be just a couple of decades from now, philosophy may reemerge just by historical accident as something that's considered a worthwhile endeavor. And there are possible answers for it, of course. And the joke of it is that a lot of these contemporary intellectuals and public thinkers and so on, for all of the denigration of philosophy, they just end up recreating all of these outmoded philosophical mistakes. They commit these mistakes again and again, and you hear it all the time, whether so-and-so is doing an interview, Jordan Peterson is doing an interview, or Neil deGrasse Tyson is talking about, someone asked his opinion on some fundamental question about the universe or whatever. And a lot of the perspectives they present as their own are sort of naive or foolish, or let's just say sort of like middle of the road, not particularly advanced positions that have already been dealt with and superseded in the actual practice of philosophy over the last 150 years. So it's a hell of an odd thing. Philosophy is certainly at its low point, it seems to me, right now. That low point may last forever, or it may not. It could change with cultural changes, and a few decades from now, a century from now, it could be back.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking lately that we might be on the verge of a historical reemergence of philosophy, and for three specific reasons. One of those reasons is UFO disclosure or open contact. The second one is parapsychology. And the third is the simulation argument. And I think that if any of the three of those things come more into focus in popular discourse, or even in discourse within the academy, we're going to see philosophy taking a much more central role. Because let's take the simulation argument. For Descartes to posit the possibility that there's an omniscient demon that's going to suspend his rational faculties or put him in a immersive dream that's indistinguishable from waking reality. That has to invoke the supernatural. That has to invoke something that, that argument still has the same force for anyone. It should. Because it calls into question the criteria by which you know the world, which should call into question rationalism and empiricism. But, the argument doesn't necessarily have the same affective force to people with a non-supernatural worldview. The simulation argument, on the other hand, some people make the argument that it's not only merely possible, but that it is in fact probable, because if one, civilizations continue to mature to the extent where it's possible to do it, two, if it is possible to do it, and three, they decide to do it, then the number of simulated realities would dwarf the number of quote-unquote real realities to such an extent that to assume that this is the one true original reality is a violation of the beloved Copernican principle. The idea that we're best off assuming that we're in the most non-special state possible, because the most non-special state is the overwhelming likelihood at any given time. And then with contact, you've got people who are going to have to be confronted with the reality of at least telepathy, and because as far as we know, all these beings are telepathic. And with parapsychology, again, you have these questions of what the mind is, and if the mind has access to other regions of space and time, then it also calls into question exactly what space and time are, too. So if any of these things get any more steam, people are going to need fundamental metaphysics and epistemology in a way that may not have seemed to be the case for a long time.
Well, it's possible. I can see it or imagine it happening a bunch of different ways. To compare it to antiquity again, I think in the remote past, the unknown outweighed the known by quite a bit. And what I mean by that is, well, it's a sort of falsehood, a comforting falsehood that gets dreamt up in the present, that in the past there was either no knowledge or there was far less knowledge than there is today. But what we see in a lot of different places at a lot of different times, mainly in the urban centers, you see that clearly there was some sort of apparatus of knowledge. The pyramids were built using sophisticated mathematics all around the world. It's been widely observed. You've got all these monuments and so on, and very detailed observations of the heavens going on. So when I say that the unknown in the past outweighed the known, it's not to deny them their own body of knowledge. In fact, if there's a way that you could quantify knowledge, not in terms of what it refers to, but I don't know, somehow the amount or the number of things known, it's very possible that that remains historically constant, that for as much as we believe today that our amount of knowledge has increased, maybe because of the natural parameters of the human brain, human mind, it could be that at any one time and in any one individual, the amount of knowledge, quote unquote, is the same from one historical epoch to the next. But what I mean is the function of knowledge, I think, has changed. And this relates to what you mentioned about these pre-Socratic texts, for example, being so heavily mystical. That is to say that in today's world, and at least for the last couple hundred years, maybe with the advent of modern science in general, I think the function of knowledge has been, at least in part, to remove our anxiety, to push aside our anxiety about the world as a place of the unknown. It serves a sort of psychological purpose. And you have to assume that it does, because otherwise we wouldn't dream up all these wonderful stories that we tell ourselves about how smart we are today and how stupid they were in the past. But that's just one example. I think that human life, from start to finish, it has to deal constantly with unknowns, unbearable unknowns. And what we have done is we have in our accumulation of knowledge, we've now developed a relationship to that body of knowledge, and the relationship that we have developed is one in which we comfort ourselves with this body of knowledge. We place all of our attention there in order to ignore that same omnipresent, unbearable unknown, which is the nature of life, which is the recurring feature of a life lived. Now, that could change. We could have all the same knowledge and science and so on, information that we do, and yet somehow by some freak accident develop a completely different relationship to that knowledge, so that now everyone is facing on a more regular basis the unbearable unknown that is central to human life. And maybe if contact were to happen in some form that's decisive and undeniable, our whole relationship to life and to experience in general would change in that way. And now, faced again with the unbearableness of the nature of life on account of its being shot through with the unknown, we would now start real thinking again. And people who have a talent for it would again develop that talent into a fine art. And then again, after a long time of absence, you would start to see real philosophers again. I don't. Let me put it this way. I mean, the normal rational point of view that we all inherit after hundreds of years is that the unknown is not unbearable because all we have to do is find out. This is sort of the perverse incentive of science, discovery, the joy of discovery. Now, you could be a Freudian, for example, or a skeptic in the Freudian mold and say, well, that jubilation that we experience with discovery is itself a dodge, and that the reason why we're so happy is really because unconsciously there's an anxiety about the unknown. You look at any detective story, the best detective stories, for example, Sherlock Holmes stories, there's a mystery and there's a solution. The solution is something that we take as a given, as being a part of the story. We take the solution to be intrinsic to the mystery. That isn't necessarily so. There is a fine little book written by Stephen King, of all people, and I haven't read all or most of his books. In fact, I have only read, some bits and pieces here and there, but he wrote a very small book for like a pulp series called The Colorado Kid. It's a fantastic book, fantastically well written. And it's about a mystery involving a guy who is dead on a beach. And you go through the whole little it's like a novella, It's a very easy, pleasurable read. But there's no solution at the end. And without giving too much away, there's like a basic impossibility about this guy being there on that beach, because the same morning or whatever, he was definitely like on the West Coast in California or something like that. And there's absolutely no way that this guy, that they can tell, there's no way this guy could have gotten to that beach to be dead at the time that he was found, from all the way across the country. And the book ends and there's no solution. And of course, this upset a great number of people who read it. But you see, this expectation that we have that every mystery has a solution every question can be answered, every problem can be solved, just like the expectation that every joke has a punchline. This is something that we've developed and constructed over time. And it's not, number one, it's not necessarily so objectively, but even putting that aside, the question of whether it is or not, kind of like the rationalists' wager, you know. I'm not even passing judgment on that. What I'm saying is that that in itself may be read as a way of dodging a more fundamental anxiety about the unknown and the extent to which the unknown as such permeates human life. And if something like contact were to occur, or if there were significant developments in parapsychology or whatever, you know, you name the example, it could be that we have to reorient ourselves toward the unknown again in a way that's more similar to what humans have done for thousands and thousands of years, in an effort to cope with that unbearableness of the unknown. You may have genuine philosophy arise again. And that it also may be, rather than modern scientists today trying to reappropriate philosophers of the past and saying that they're natural scientists, it could be that the real urge behind philosophy in the beginning was not an urge toward taxonomy, classifying this and that, but something much more human and recognizable, namely the anxiety caused by the unknown.
Yeah. You know, I think there's an artificial closure that we have, the sense that we've traversed all of the possible horizons of knowledge. And in a way, that might have to do with the sensation of having fully encircled the earth in human civilization. Because experientially, we have this sensation that there is no direction you can travel that leads to the truly unknown. And I think similarly, uh, when we go through our education, every direction that inquiry could possibly go in has a name, and it has an enormous body of literature. So let's say your imagination starts to drift in the direction of life, and let's say, metaphorically speaking, in that direction, you find that that domain is called biology, and it has an enormous body of literature such that no human being could read all of it in a lifetime. And the same for physical processes. Like, let's say you're really interested in, the stars and in, astronomical phenomena. Well, you look in that direction and you have astronomy and cosmology. And again, you have an enormous body of literature that no one could ever read all of it. So in any possible direction that curiosity could drift, you wind up in the same situation. And this creates the impression that the unknown has been subdued and that knowledge has thoroughly eclipsed the absence of knowledge. But when you get into these disciplines, or at least some of the things that I'm familiar with, you find that the unknown is always present. And, you could give a gross example of that, like the enormous percentage of the universe, which is dark matter and dark energy. Or you could give a more subtle statement of that, like the fact that really quantum mechanics doesn't provide an ontology. The mathematical formalism itself doesn't theoretically dictate either a many worlds interpretation or a Copenhagen interpretation or whatever. These sort of pictorial ontological schemes that we think of when we imagine what quantum mechanics is about are kind of a second order philosophical interpretation. And even the most subtle example, possibly, of the ever presence of the unknown is consciousness itself. Because, I mean, to me, you can capture the mystery of consciousness just by considering the fact that if you're going to say that two things are identical, then they have to have the same properties all the way down the list, right? So the neural correlate of consciousness and the qualitative phenomenal experience of consciousness do not have the same properties. They're not the same in a irreducibly clean and straightforward way. And I think in that respect alone, thinking about consciousness opens up the doorway into the unknown, into the great mystery. So to sum up, I mean, you get the impression that everything is conquered, but it's not. The unknown is there every step of the way, all the time, in all directions, always.
Well, I agree, but the interesting question to me is why that does not provoke more anxiety or disorientation or whatever term you wish to use. And it's in part for the reason that you mentioned. The extent of knowledge today is so vast compared to a person's ability to master it, that it creates the confusion that because there's always more knowledge in principle that exceeds you as a person, personally speaking, that therefore knowledge extends into infinity. You know, just because knowledge extends past the horizon, you sort of allow yourself to be comforted by the supposition that it extends infinitely, or, which is another way of saying the same thing, that it extends infinitely in principle, that everything can be known, that whatever is not known now can in principle be known. And people who have this sort of faith do so, they have it for good reason, because so far it's borne itself out. Knowledge is relational, so anything that's known now can be related to something that's known tomorrow. And we've done enough of this, relating new discoveries and new facts to existing discoveries and existing facts, that we therefore think there's no reason why it can't continue. But it's very interesting, you know, if there were some sort of dramatic changes in the world as we know it, and these changes were sufficiently dramatic that they bled into our day-to-day experience, then we might have to face the unknown as such, maybe as it was more traditionally experienced, and that is not as some potential new mastery, but again, as sort of like the unbearable abyss. And I tend to think that unbearable quality of the unknown is the primary. I think it will be seen that it's, I mean, ultimately that's the truth of it, because the greatest unknown, oh, there we go. The greatest unknown, that is death.
Yeah. I'm going to let this fire hydrant, fire truck pass before I...
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say, if that dies down, well, if you look at the way that human beings deal with death, and they deal with death today in a far less able way than they used to, which is not to say it was ever dealt with capably, but today especially, death is brushed under the rug as much as possible. All of the old elaborate rituals and the ceremonial aspects and the community aspects of dealing with the fact of death have sort of slipped away in the modern Western world. And if somebody reaches a sufficiently advanced age, they get put in some home, so they're out of sight, out of mind, where they can die among strangers alone. And this is our cultural configuration, and we sort of accept this for a bunch of bullshit reasons. And you have to ask whether this happens not simply because of the economic calculations that go on and the personal considerations, which we all recognize today, but also for more fundamental reasons that, we cannot face death as such, or we are able to face it less perhaps than we could in the past. And that's part and parcel of the same problem. We don't have to face the unknown on a daily basis today, and we comfort ourselves constantly with a faith in knowledge. And death still remains an unknown, an unconquerable unknown, and therefore you look at the way we deal with death and people who are dying, and to get them out of the way as quickly and as completely as possible. They may all be sides of the same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's interesting to me that the oldest evidence we have for any form of spirituality or religion is Paleolithic burial sites, right? We see that these people honored the deceased, and that there was some sort of ritual element, and that there are aspects of it that seem to correspond to what we would later know as myth or propitiation of spirits. So I think it's fair to say that death is the first great mystery that animates the philosophical project. And I think if you're zoomed out to that sort of macroscopic degree of resolution, then the philosophical project really runs together with the religious project, with the mythological project, the effort to make sense of the world.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And I think that we've really closed ourselves in, because as you know, we put people away to die. And in like manner, we put people away who are sick and people who are old. And it's funny, because if you look at the myth of the historical Buddha, he was put in an environment where you couldn't see the old, the sick, or the dead. And that's precisely the situation that we actually live in as a society. And that might really maim our sensitivity to fundamental questions.
I happened to come across recently the well-known quote by Camus, who said something like, the only real philosophical problem is suicide. And to me, that very formulation is a dodge, because suicide, death itself, in general, suicide is just an act that brings it about. You can read any number of accounts or today watch videos or you name it about the things that go on in hospice care and the things faced by the elderly as they die or they're terminally ill and so on. Death is something that comes to everybody, as far as we know. And if you take Camus and his statement to be emblematic, you can come up with a completely opposite conclusion to what we were talking about earlier, the sort of flip side, which is to say that all of modern philosophy is the dodge. I liken it to the development of the child. In one model, you've got a baby there, which is like just a squirrely sort of mass of drives, and it's totally helpless. And there's a lot of confusion and that sort of thing in the infant. And as the child develops, it very quickly starts to learn to crawl and learn to speak and then learn to walk. And in these developments, you have you accumulate feelings of mastery. This is the jubilation of the child, when the child's able to walk for the first time, or it's able to ride a bicycle for the first time, or all these things that make up the wonders of childhood. Learning and being able to do, and you acquire again and again these feelings of mastery. It's inevitable, but it's in a way a distraction. The entry into life that the infant takes on its way through then up through childhood and so on. I mean, it has to be that way, but at the same time, it's a kind of distraction. And you can see the development of philosophy almost in the same terms. You have maybe in the very beginning, to the extent there was ever a beginning to it, a single origin point. Back in the distant beginnings of philosophy, you have nothing but the sort of mythical grappling with the unknown and the creation of meaning and the organization of it. But then, particularly in ancient Greece, you have a merging of this discourse, this approach, with the development of a mathematical approach, geometry, geometrical reasoning. These two, when they came together in the historical accident that was ancient Greece, they sort of, that's the origin point, again, to the extent there is one, for what we recognize as philosophy. So in the discussions of Socrates and all the great thinkers, even all the way up through the modern times, when you have Descartes or Spinoza, and they're laying out axioms and premises, and trying to apply a formal apparatus to reasoning as a way to reason toward truth, some final truth. You have the same faith in mastery, the same faith in maybe even life itself, that ends up being a distraction from the unconquerable unknown, which now today we've mostly forgotten. But it's interesting, at least to me, that you can see the development of philosophy and the development of the human individual as an organism in similar terms.
Yeah. I think that what we really are candles that have been lit in the dark. And I think that's a good way to think about conscious, subjective, phenomenal, qualitative experience. Because in the absence of a consciousness that's going to render reality in qualitative terms, color, texture, shape, etc., you just have this infinite non-qualitative expanse, this blank that isn't even a blank. And I had a really visceral experience of this that I wrote about. You read that account that I typed up of this experience on LSD in the forest, and it was really it was dramatic and visceral, because the sense of the contingency of the senses, the sense that the senses are uh, biologically determined, but also arbitrary inlets for data about the world to be filtered in and structured into a sort of virtual reality that's run on wetware. Uh, that was the fundamental reality. And at the time, I was so disidentified from it that I might as well have been looking at a virtual reality avatar that was 200 light years away, in the sense that the sensory apparatus that I was looking through didn't carry with it any implicit default character of being I and me or mine. It was just a construct. But the key point is the nearness of that infinite non-qualitative expanse, and the fact that that really was fundamental, and that sight, sound, hearing, and touch were like a flickering candle in an infinite dark. And it seems to me that that's what we all are. We're flickering candles in the infinite dark. That's what that's what Heidegger talked about as the clearing in the woods. And if you're not sensitive to that, then you're blinded by the apparent givenness of the world. And in a way, the epistemological position that arises from not being sensitive to that is like the insensitivity of a fish to the existence of water. You're saturated in your own cognitive and sensory constructs to the point where you think reality is given, but it really isn't. There's just the mode of grasping that you have, and the ways that you're trying to master it and cope with it. And you take the ways that you're trying to master it and cope with it, as you were saying, to be reality itself.
Well, it raises all sorts of questions, and not necessarily good ones either, because again, it's sort of, wherever you go, there you are. If it's the nature of the human being to increasingly be preoccupied with what he or she experiences to the exclusion of everything else, to whatever extent there is in everything else, until you experience some sort of limit phenomenon that takes you temporarily out of that experience and then changes your relationship to that day-to-day given experience and so on. To my mind, it sort of creates a feeling of helplessness, because you don't have, in that scenario, which may be entirely true, you don't have in that scenario any kind of access to truth. In other words, you can regard what we all experience as, in a sense, an illusion, or as incomplete, or however you want to characterize it, when you've stepped out of it slightly for whatever reason, either through substances or aliens show up in your room at night or whatever the limit experience is, which reorients you to the whole thing. But it's only by virtue of that reorientation that you come to this new way of looking at it. It's only by virtue of the events, rather, the contingent accidental events, that you come to the reorientation toward your hitherto unquestioned reality. But that still puts us firmly within the accidental and the contingent. In other words, there are a lot of people who, if you mention something like psychedelics or I don't know whether there's a preferred term now instead of psychedelics, I can't recall what it is, but there's a whole host of people who will say, well, if you take these substances and you do it the right way, X, Y, Z, so on and so forth, it will show you the truth of reality, in as much as now you have stepped outside of what you thought was reality and you acquire a new orientation toward the reality when you return to it. But there's another way of looking at it, which is this is just another accidental contingent movement within the same reality. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that, and if it takes an event to get you to see the quote unquote truth, even if that's not a completely determined truth, so on and so forth. I'm not saying an absolute truth in any kind of limited way. But if it takes, an accidental event for that to occur, that accidental event is still firmly within, for being accidental and contingent, it's of a piece with the reality that you've now come to hold as suspect, because that reality, the one that we experience in the day to day, is accidental and contingent, and it's the contingency of it all and the constant flow of chance and randomness and that sort of thing that we take an attitude toward, an accepting attitude toward, as a given, as life, so on and so forth. But the character of it's still there, and that character, if the character is still present in the accidental experience that causes you to reorient yourself to reality as you've known it.
Sure.
I mean, that could be taken as a kind of rationalist's lament, because for someone who has a faith in reason and so on, in a traditional sense, you think you can reason your way toward the truth. Like there's a royal road to it. The same goes for the scientist, although in a slightly different way. The scientist thinks that you can arrive at the truth by accumulating facts, verified facts. So there's a royal road to the truth that way. There are plenty of people who, in a way, take as given that the reality they've experienced by taking a substance or by having certain other kinds of experiences, the radical reorientation to their more mundane reality, that thing that happened is another kind of royal road to truth. But you could say it's accidental and it's contingent. It's just a minor event. It's one event in a long succession of events. So the basic character of the reality is never in question. So then what's the royal road to truth?
Well, I think there's only groping in the dark. And I guess you could say that the sense in which you allege that pragmatism isn't really philosophy is the sense in which pragmatism is saying, look, there's just the groping. And because all we have is the groping and all we are is the groping blindly in the dark, then we should reconstitute our theory of knowledge to reflect that and not to presuppose anything about a correspondence between the representation, the groping, and the unknown thing that we're attempting to understand. In a sense, then, pragmatism is the renunciation of anything other than power, in the specific sense in which Richard Rorty said that to know X is to be able to do X or to be X. And there's really nothing besides that which is meaningful. So, I mean, in a way, that's not too different than any other movement in philosophy, because it seems to me that the movement of the history of philosophy is people ditching whatever the common presupposition was to both sides of an argument. And then you wind up creating a new dichotomy based on a new set of presuppositions, which then get questioned in order to, work around the seemingly irresolvable difficulty.
Well, there I don't agree, at least as far as pragmatism is concerned, simply because I think something very specific does happen with pragmatism, and that is it tries from a place within philosophy to disqualify philosophy. I don't think that, American pragmatism in the 20th century was just affecting another Kantian turn. I don't think it was trying to say, well, there are certain limits or conditions to what we can know, and therefore we should work within them. That's very different. It's very different than what Kant did in that regard, because Kant still resolved the questions in a very peculiar way by sort of balancing them against each other and saying, okay, philosophy is still possible within these limits. Pragmatism, it seems to me, the whole tone and tenor of it and the substance of the arguments has always been about jettisoning philosophy, saying that it's not credible or that the bulk of what we recognize as philosophy is not legitimate. But it still tries to do so from within philosophy. I mean, we recognize pragmatism as a movement within philosophy. That's how the history of philosophy treats it. And it's that I take issue with. If you start from outside of philosophy, you never enter philosophy, and you say, fuck philosophy, that's legitimate in a sense. And I'd further qualify by just repeating that the conclusions of this or that pragmatism may be true, they may be valid, but that doesn't make pragmatism legitimate as philosophy. It could well be that philosophy as practiced is illegitimate and that it's always headed toward a dead end, but that nonetheless is what it is.
Yeah, in that sense, there is a real continuity between pragmatism and, let's say, positivism and analytic philosophy. Because there's just this effort to say it's over, it's done with. And, it might be that has to do with what we were saying earlier about trying to, what you were saying especially, about trying to escape the unknown and trying to escape the anxiety of the unknown. Because if we say philosophy is over, then whether or not we're saying this explicitly or whether or not we believe it consciously, it's one and the same as your gesture of saying that science has won. And in a sort of triumphant apotheosis, the human mind has conquered the universe.
Yeah, I think there's a sizable component to that. The major pragmatist thinkers certainly have a certain loyalty to modern science, and just as you say, are very comfortable. I mean, it's a very comfortable sort of overall set of positions. It seems to me they're very self-satisfied, and when they declare philosophy is over, in all the various ways that they do, the problem, it seems to me, is that all of these positions are they're postulated as philosophical positions, which number one makes it questionable, but number two, it means that they can be answered and reclaimed by philosophy. You know, if you engage in an argument with someone on false premises and you allow the argument to proceed, you know, you shouldn't be surprised at what you get. I mean, you're not separating yourself from them. You're not, when it comes to pragmatism, this is a minor thing to discuss, but it's not as if there is an alternate paradigm, really, that succeeds in fully vanquishing philosophy and ejecting it. Instead, you have a kind of faux philosophy, which from within the limits of philosophy attempts to say, okay, philosophy's dead. And we're going to just, we can't answer these philosophical questions, so we're going to put them aside for other reasons, utility, meaningfulness, et cetera, what you can do, to cite the example that you mentioned. Well, that they don't meet. I mean, that's not a real engagement. It's not an effective negation. It's not an outsmarting. It's not an outmaneuvering. It's simply it's a weird kind of untenable stance to take. But relating it to the bigger question, certainly if you look at the major pragmatist thinkers, I think you have even less of a sense that they are in any way discomfited by the unknown. I mean, to the extent that the continental philosophers engage in metaphysics, you could at least say that they are willing to entertain a certain kind of unknown, a certain kind of variability at the level of fundamental realities, to the extent that they mix and match terms and come up with new concepts and new perspectives and so on. Whereas the pragmatists feel more comfortable in just rejecting all of it entirely.
Sure.
But again, it's a spectrum.
It seems to me that, in a sense, you could boil down the whole philosophical enterprise to maybe at least two questions. And number one, why is there something rather than nothing? Number two, what is consciousness? And I guess you could also say, how do we know anything at all? And on the existential front, and this is a variation of what you were talking about with Camus, the only philosophical question is suicide. Is existence justified? Is life worth the suffering that it necessarily entails? Now, the real first and foremost amongst these questions is the something or nothing question, like why is being. It's interesting that at least as far as I know, the pre-Socratics didn't really ask why is being, they asked what is being. But I think that's kind of the same thing. One is just sort of stating it temporally. One is looking at it in the present tense. But it seems to me that what all of these movements are trying to reject is that first question, the why or the what of being as such. And as far as the second question goes, you've got consciousness. And it's interesting to me that, in ancient philosophy, we don't seem to get the same type of questioning we have about mind. Obviously, there's stuff about the philosophy of mind, or that pertains to the philosophy of mind, but maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like mind has come to seem more problematic over time. And I guess I could just respond to what you're saying by saying that, maybe the pragmatists and also the logical positivists and the analytic philosophers are trying to banish the being question, so that then if being isn't in question, then the question of consciousness falls under the domain of materialism. And I guess they're also banishing the question of how do we know anything at all, too. So that then the questions of mind and the questions of the justification of existence are walled off and protected from what were traditionally considered questions about the ultimate.
Well, I think it would be interesting if somebody did a history of consciousness, not as a phenomenon, but as a concept, because one of the beauties of what today is called postmodernism, post-structuralism, and all of that is that you can find in it historical analyses of Foucault is a prime example, but there are many other people who've done it, where you can take something not as a given, but look at it strictly in historical and conceptual terms. You could analyze the texts of philosophy, but not only philosophy, to see how the concept, how the word came about and how it's evolved as a kind of contingent fact, a historical occurrence. I was on a Facebook forum a couple years back, one of these Gnosticism forums that was focused on a podcast on Gnosticism and all that. And you had all these people going on and on about consciousness. And I got into the one day and I said, well, I personally don't see any evidence that consciousness exists. And you would have thought someone had just taken a dump in the middle of church. People are flipping out all over the place in hysterics over it. And it was a somewhat unexpected reaction. I mean, it was certainly a contrary position to what everybody else was taking, but they all took it so personally, and they were all so completely unable to question consciousness as a given, for example. But it seems to me that in all likelihood, consciousness is a construct, and that we conflate the phenomenon with this concept and all of its historical baggage and all the different ways the word can be used. I mean, even in English, there are multiple meanings that, you could really point out the disparate character of all these meanings. You could also point out the way that they contaminate each other. I mean, we'll say someone is, in one context, we'll say someone is unconscious because he or she's not awake. Someone's been hit over the head. Oh, he's not conscious. Or someone's taken a bunch of sleeping pills. Oh, he's not conscious. Well, what is consciousness then? Is it being awake? Is it this? Is it that? You got a whole bunch of different phenomena sort of lashed together, everyday phenomena that are lashed together that call for the use of the word. And then you've got these metaphysical and spiritual discourses that employ the word. I don't know.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I was thinking about this only yesterday. Um, you know, it seems from a certain point of view that consciousness is the only root fact, right? Uh, but that's not necessarily the case. Let's say that it's logically possible for there to exist a world in which sentient beings are aware of a rich vocabulary of concepts. Let's say tree, wind, tiger, self, other, male, female. And they have a rich and functional vocabulary of concepts about the world, but they don't have any concept of consciousness. I think it could be argued that if it is logically possible for such a world to exist, let's say what would be for us the Paleolithic world, where you've got early uh, human beings beginning to develop language, but let's say they don't have a concept for consciousness, or that could be the case in any other extraterrestrial world, right? If that's logically possible, then consciousness isn't primitive. Consciousness is a concept about something that is actually more given. It reminds me of something that Alan Watts said. And the first time I heard it, it really impressed me. And sometimes when I think about it, it impresses me again. He said that reality isn't physical, that's just an idea. And that's not so crazy. People say that all the time. But it really struck me when he proceeded to say, reality isn't spiritual, that's just an idea. And then he hit a gong. Reality is this, right? Um, so as I was thinking about this, the idea that consciousness isn't actually given, it got me to thinking there could be other contingent, like potential parallel ways that we tried to ground this weirdness in a different way. And maybe there are examples of it in history. Like, you know, you were just suggesting that someone could do a history of the permutations of how people have dealt with this. Because look at it this way. You have a triad, right? You have, on one end of the triad, you have the noumenon, the world, so in itself. On the other end of the triad, you have, well, in the middle of the triad, you have what we think, where the place, a blank place where we put consciousness, right? And then we have, but what if that space, and the third part of it would be the neural correlate of consciousness. Let's just presuppose the reality of the objective physicalist universe. So you've got the actual state of affairs, and then a blank space where I'm emphasizing it as a blank space because we're going to substitute something else for consciousness in a second. And then the neural correlate. Well, what if the Platonic forms are a different thing that's put in the same blank space at the center of the triad? So instead of consciousness, you're positing the forms. So you've still got the world, and you've got the neural correlate of consciousness, although, of course, an ancient person wouldn't have known about that. But in that strange paradoxical place at the center of the triad, where you're trying to give ontological sense to what we think of as qualia or sensiblia, right? That's where Plato put the forms, because consciousness isn't the only natural category that can occupy that space. And the forms were another contingent historical effort to reconcile the paradoxical nature of that space. And we aren't sensitive to that. And that's why, for Plato, true knowledge was the intellectual apprehension of a form, right? Does that make sense?
Sure. And what you see there, it sounds like you've backed your way into sort of like seeing Plato with clarity, because one of the problems of studying philosophy for anybody is there's an assumption of continuity, and to some extent, this illusion of continuity is created just by the sheer existence of there being a history of philosophy, quote unquote. But when you encounter these thinkers in their own right, what you find is there's a pretty unmistakable discontinuity that separates all of them from each other. And when you come across Plato in exactly the way you've described, organizing the world and trying to answer the questions that he's got in that way, it's a solution that's unique to him in a sense, regardless if there are followers or people repeating the doctrine and so on and so forth. And so with each successive major thinker, you have almost a soliloquy. For as much as they talk about the thinkers of the past, the modern philosophers who do, you have almost like a self-enclosed universe. And this gets back to what we were talking about there being more than just one or two solutions that are opposed to each other. You have this multiplicity of very richly developed but independent solutions to these questions in a way that stand entirely alone. And if you're able to study a great thinker, read what's available, and grasp that universe of thought as, in its true separateness, I think myself personally, that's probably the closest you can come to understanding the thinker, because for every person who sits down and tries to think up solutions to these questions and to organize their world in a meaningful way in a system of philosophy, it seems like it's always like that.
Yeah. And I mean, that comes down to the question of what the hell are we? I mean, we wake up in the world as cognitive, linguistic, sentient, experiential beings. And the amount of machinery that's required to make that happen, whether you want to think about it in terms of neurological machinery or transcendental machinery, one way or the other, an awful lot of things have to be the case to allow for that. And we're these spontaneously emergent biological artificial intelligences in a way. And I use the word artificial intelligence to emphasize the sort of accidental and contingent nature of it. We think there's a kind of ontological gulf between a biological intelligence and a that's arisen because of the process of evolution, and an artificial intelligence. But they're both just things that happen to come into being because of a particular set of circumstances, which allow for very fine-tuned coincidence of forces and factors. And we're here, and the way that I perceive the world, and then I try to reduce that down into a very narrow channel of language, and then you receive it, and then you reconstruct its meaning. But its meaning for you is totally different, because all you have is this channel of speech. And the entire meaning of that channel of speech is brought to life through your web of associations and memories and knowledge and perceptions and so on, right? So what the hell are we? The brain is the most complicated object that we know about in the physical universe. And what we are, from a physicalist point of view, is this storm of electrical activity. I think this is kind of a graphic representation even of the Buddhist notion of selflessness. Because think of it this way. Daniel Dennett does this demonstration where he says, look at this cathedral, all right? Now look at this anthill. Now they look very similar, but the anthill is the result of a lot of stupid things, i.e. individual ants working together, and then they create something which we would think of as being the product of a directing, intelligent mind. But what is different about your mind? Because your mind is the result of a bunch of stupid things, insentient things, unless panpsychism is true. But even then, comparatively speaking, stupid things like individual neurons firing off in this fantastically complex pattern. I saw a presentation the other day saying that apparently the patterns that neurons make is this weird 11-dimensional geometry. And what I'm getting at is how weird that is. And given that weirdness, which is not always even in your face, but is the very animating activity that allows you to know the world, then it's like we're not just things that we know trying to confront a mystery. We're a mystery confronting a mystery. And not only are we a mystery confronting a mystery, but we're a bewilderingly complex mystery confronting a bewilderingly complex mystery, of which we are a part anyway.
Well, there you have it. I mean, I concur. And that is in part my objection to pragmatism, because, the type of reasoning that you've just employed and the conclusion that you've presented wouldn't be possible if you just rejected all of these questions at the outset. I mean, even if thinking leads nowhere, it's always a different nowhere. And it seems like there's always thinking to be done. Now, that's not the same as saying that one should have faith in a conclusion or an ultimate truth. But it's also not the same as saying that, well, let me put it this way. There are times when taking a sort of outside meta perspective is itself false. And if, in the case of not only pragmatism, but all sorts of contemporary rejections of philosophy, they try to take this meta perspective and they say, well, this, that, the other thing. It's just a lot of meaningless questions. They'll never be answered and so on. You lose, you miss out on, for example, what we've just been talking about.
Yeah.
And then, of course, again, to relate it to another part of the conversation, I mean, what you've described is another way of naming. What you've done is you've named the great unknown again. It's something that's been on my mind for a number of years, the mystery with a capital M, which I think you do see observed here and there in antiquity and in different cultures around the world, even though the mystery as such can be eclipsed by the giving of meaning, the ritualism, and so on and so forth. But certainly, how do you separate it out? And when you talk about a human being being a bewilderingly complex entity and so on, well, where does that complexity end? Because I think, without doubt, you can start with the brain and you can refer to its complexity. Of course, on the one hand, you have to say complexity to whom? from the point of view of ordinary consciousness interacting with the world, considering the quantity of nerve cells in the brain, and then the exponentially higher quantity of interrelationships between them, you're dealing with staggering numbers, astronomical numbers that you don't encounter in day-to-day life. So you could say, well, from a human perspective, an everyday perspective, because we have that perspective, that's why it's so complex. Because it's complex to us. Is it absolutely complex? Different question. But on the other hand, you could say, well, where are the boundaries drawn? I mean, are we arbitrarily circumscribing the human being, even if we go past the brain and we include sensory apparatus and this, that, and the other thing? If you look at the example of the anthill, for example, you know, we would say, well, the anthill is the thing, unbeknownst to the individual ants. Well, what is the anthill to us? What's our anthill? Well, the simple parallel would be, well, human civilization. But we take human civilization for good reason to be a sort of random, chaotic mess that in a way is only the sum of its parts because it fails so constantly. But what if there are other aspects that we don't see to human civilization, to humanity as a collective organism, if such a thing exists? And then what if the boundary shouldn't even be drawn there? You know, what if there's a human Earth system? Or what if there's a human Earth moon system or a human Earth moon sun system? And where are the boundaries of the organism, quote unquote, to be drawn? I mean, the mystery grows greater.
Absolutely. You know, all this brings to mind what's probably one of my favorite sentences in all of philosophy, which is not how the world is the mystical, but that the world is the mystical. And as I'm sure you know, that occurs toward the end of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And to me, that really says a lot about this whole domain we're talking about, the recognition of the omnidirectional, all-pervading mystery. Something I've been sort of toying around with lately, and by lately I mean maybe for the past half a year, is the notion of the possibility of physicalist mysticism. Not that I'm a physicalist, but per se, but I think you could construct a physicalist mysticism, and that could sort of provide a limit case for the relevance and the currency of mysticism, even in the modern scientific world. So, to get a sense of what I mean by physicalist mysticism, just consider something like the phylogenetic tree. And you can trace human ancestry back to these proto-human hominids and early mammals, and there's a point, you can trace that back to a point where mammals and reptiles sort of split off, and you could trace that back to a point where, you know, plants and animals split off, or where sponges split off, and ultimately the whole phylogenetic tree is like a clawed hand, or like a tree in hyperspace, branching back to the first instance of cellular life spontaneously emerging. And then you could jump to a different graph. If you look at some sort of outside of time graph of inflation, that all ultimately goes back through earlier and earlier epochs of the universe until that hits this point of infinite density and infinite mass and infinite volume that we call singularity. So in that sense, in this very tangible, rigorous, physical sense, everything is one thing, which is simultaneously enfolding in time and transcending time. But even that apparently is just, an arbitrary undulation in the multiverse. This is just a region of an infinite existence, most of which is utterly uninhabitable because it doesn't produce cosmological constants or ratios of matter and antimatter that are conducive to life. And we just, for anthropic principle reasons, we happen to inhabit one of those regions that is hospitable to life. And so you've got this infinite panoply of existence, which has no origin and has no end, which is simultaneously temporal and atemporal, and in which we emerge through what is simultaneously the chance collision of causes and conditions and the deterministically necessary collision of causes and conditions, as an instance of that system being aware of itself. And I feel like everything I just said, maybe not the emphasis given, but the factual substance of what I just said is just the conventional scientific view of what the universe and the multiverse is. But from a certain point of view and with a certain type of emphasis, that is radical, transcendental mysticism,
Well, I fully agree. And if you take the term that you've put forward, this sort of physicalist mysticism, you could, land not very far from how they thought about the world in classical antiquity and in all sorts of cultures, times, and places around the globe. The fact, not even necessarily the fact that the world is, but what the world constantly presents, what we're calling the world, it's a bewildering thing to the extent that it's even a thing. Any way that you try to get your bearings on it is sort of a false enterprise. It's a necessary one, but the extent of the great mystery with a capital M, it's not only something that has a basis in what was the origin of life or what was the origin of creation and so on, but it's right in your face at every moment. At least that's how it's always seemed to me. The walls of the room surrounding you, the chair that you're sitting in, peeking your head outside, what you see at any given instant. There's no basis for it, in a sense. It is the fact. But it's also something that is so large and precedes you. It precedes any conceptuality. And it'd be very easy, I think, to say that in olden times, prior to the accumulated body of knowledge that we comfort ourselves with today and that we use to kind of insulate ourselves off, that's the natural mode of being in the world for a human being. That, you're compassed round by the great unknown. And people in antiquity or around the world thousands of years ago, of course, they didn't know anything about quantum theory, and they didn't know anything that we claim that we know today. And yet, nevertheless, the experience was the same. And it does relate to what we were talking about earlier with the question of whether people could be forced to adopt a new orientation to what they know and to experience in general because of something like contact. What it suggests is that the orientation is the thing and not necessarily what's known. If you could if you can adopt a radical reorientation to what you already know, that opens the door to all sorts of possibilities, because now it's not simply a question of individual facts or a body of knowledge or a set of information, but now you've got different ways you can position yourself toward what's known. You have more flexibility. There's more possibility.
Absolutely.